A lot of phones these days look pretty similar, with their large, tall glass designs and thin bezels. The iPhone SE 2020 brings you back to a time when phones were more compact, and shrinking those bezels wasn't such a priority. It's made of Gorilla Glass with an aluminum frame, and it's super small, light, and comfortable to wield in the hand. Pretty much all of the hardware in the SE is the same as what we had in the iPhone 8, and that includes the IP67 waterproofing. The product red finish we have here is striking, and just the Apple logo itself can be enough to turn some heads. From this angle, all that separates this from the expensive models visually is the modest bump for the single camera. Flip over to the front, however, and you'll immediately see the difference from the newer iPhones. The bezels above and below the screen give you a 2014 sort of vibe. At least you won't have to worry about a cutout for the selfie cam and Face ID hardware. This is complete with a home key / fingerprint scanner down at the bottom. In an age where many manufacturers have moved on to under-display readers, this phone takes us back to having it below the screen. The screen itself is a 4.7-inch IPS LCD with a resolution of 1334 by 750 or 326 ppi. It's sharp enough, and because of its 16:9 aspect ratio, video content fits easily on screen without stretching or black bars. Max brightness is very good too, up to 670 nits, and contrast is good, though black levels leave more to be desired. Colors are very accurate, and there's an option for true tone color correction adjustments to adapt the white point on the fly based on ambient lighting. For your audio, the iPhone SE 2020 has a pair of stereo speakers. It's a hybrid setup, with a bottom-firing loudspeaker and the earpiece acting as the second one. They're balanced enough, and loudness is very, very good. The quality is nice too, with good bass, though not quite at the level of the iPhone 11 Pro.
Absolute beginners came to Georgetown. They were wearing Harris tweed and pork pie hats.
The phone's interface is Apple's iOS 13.4 at the time of this video, and there should be support for 5 years of uninterrupted software updates. One of the neat new features here is a system-wide dark mode. The UI is pretty much what you'd expect from an iPhone these days, except for navigation, since you only rely on the home key and there are no swipes. Multimedia is handled through the Photos, Music, or Apple TV apps. You also get Apple's digital assistant, Siri, which is easily accessed by holding down the home key. You can assign almost anything to a shortcut accessible through Siri. Just remember that storage is finite on this device. You have options for 64, 128, or 256 gigs, and it isn't expandable. The major feature that sets the iPhone SE apart from the iPhone 8 is the new chipset. It runs on the 7nm Apple A13 Bionic, the same as the premium iPhone 11 Pro. Performance is awesome, topping both the Apple and the Android charts. It blows the iPhone 8 away, and is clearly the better device for running heavy games, and it's more future-proof too. Unfortunately, the cutting-edge performance doesn't extend to the battery life. The battery's small capacity is the same as the iPhone 8's, 1,820 mAh. The iPhone SE scored an endurance rating of just 59 hours in our battery tests. It seems you can only do so much with such a small cell. You won't even be able to charge it fast either with the bundled 5-watt charger. We were only able to get from 0 to 27% in half an hour. In comparison, an 18-watt Apple charger refills about 57% of the empty battery. The benefits of upgrading to a faster charger are obvious, and while you're at it, you can grab a wireless charger since there's support for that too. Now moving on to the camera, singular here, which is a rarity these days. Even though it's the same 12-megapixel camera found on the iPhone 8, the advances in image processing are really noticeable. In daylight, the iPhone SE takes very natural-looking photos. The contrast is superb, the colors are spot on, and noise is non-existent. Dynamic range is really wide too, thanks in part to Apple's Smart HDR. The detail levels are very good, even excellent in some spots. The phone does have some trouble with intricate details, but for this price point, the quality is superb. Portrait mode is available, and since there's just one camera, it creates the blurred background effect totally through a software-based depth map. The subject separation is far from flawless, but these are decent for not having a depth sensor. The camera's low-light performance is a big improvement over the iPhone 8, thanks to better processing. There's enough resolved detail, generally balanced exposure, and great color saturation. Dynamic range isn't the best though. and it's too bad that there's no support for night mode here to improve on that. The front-facing camera is the same 7-megapixel unit we saw on the iPhone 7 and 8, and it provides awesome quality. These are some of the best selfies we've taken recently, and they put a lot of Android phones to shame. There's outstanding detail, great contrast, and wide dynamic range. There's also support for portrait selfies, and these are pretty decent, similar separation-wise to the portraits from the main camera. Videos can be recorded with the main cam at up to 4K at 30 or 60 FPS. 4K video has great quality that is quite similar to that of the still images. There are great colors and contrast, wide dynamic range, and pretty good detail, except in some complex areas. There is a setting for a lower 24 FPS frame rate meant to lower the shutter speed for better low-light video capture. The result is brighter than regular video at nighttime, but the quality still isn't flagship worthy. It's just fine. There is video stabilization and it works in all resolutions and frame rates, and the result is flagship level. Looks-wise, the P40 Pro doesn't break the mold, but it's quite fitting for a modern flagship. It's made from glass with a frame of aluminum, and the squared-off corners help it to stand out a bit from competitors. The back is curved, and although the finish is a bit conservative, it's quite sleek and elegant looking. The major feature here is of course the quad camera setup, which takes up a decent amount of real estate. Of course, even though the P40 Pro is made of glass, you should expect it to be relatively durable, and the phone has full IP68 water and dust protection too. Flipping over to the front, we have the P40 Pro's 6.6-inch curved OLED screen. Its resolution is in between Full HD and QHD at 1200 by 2640 pixels, and the display wraps around the edges of the phone. Up at the top, there is a wide punch hole cutout for the selfie cam and TOF sensor. Also note that there isn't a traditional earpiece for calls. Instead, the sound is generated by vibrations of the screen. The P40 Pro is Huawei's first smartphone with a high refresh rate display. At 90Hz, it's not as fast as the 120Hz you see in the Galaxy S20, but it's enough to make moving elements on the screen appear much smoother. Unlike the S20, you don't have to turn down the resolution to enable the high refresh rate. Content looks great, with deep blacks, great contrast and accurate colors. Max brightness is decent at around 430 nits. You don't get much of a boost in the sun, however. With auto mode on, you'll get up to about 500 nits. The display supports HDR+, however, because of software limitations, you won't be able to get that content via the popular streaming services. Unlocking the phone is done through an optical under-display fingerprint reader. It's larger than before, and among the fastest and most reliable you can get right now. There's also the face unlock option, which is quite secure, thanks to the 3D scan provided by the TOF camera. It works even in the dark. For audio, the P40 Pro has a single bottom firing loudspeaker. We would have preferred a stereo setup, but seeing as how there's no traditional earpiece, maybe it isn't possible here. As far as quality goes, this speaker's loudness is good, and mids and highs sound decent, but the lows are a little lacking. Of course, if you want to plug in regular 3.5mm headphones, you'll need to use a USB-C adapter here. Realme phones are known to look flashy, and the Realme 6 Pro is one of the flashiest to come out yet. Just note that for now, the phone has yet to be announced globally. Like many other mid-rangers, this one is built of plastic. It doesn't feel cheap though, and there's even some waterproofing in the design, even though there is no official IP rating. The design is quite breathtaking, with a neon zigzag effect that changes color depending on how you look at it. It gives me an 80s arcade sort of vibe. On the front is a 6.6-inch IPS LCD screen with a 1080p resolution. You'll notice the wide cutout at the top for the dual selfie cam. The newest trend as far as smartphone screens go is having a high refresh rate, and this is featured on the Realme 6 Pro's LCD. It refreshes at 90Hz, and this means moving elements will appear smoother to the eye. This screen looks sharp at about 400 ppi, and colors can be relatively accurate if you tweak them in settings. Contrast is just okay though, and this screen isn't very bright. We measured a maximum of around 420 nits, and that's not a whole lot for an LCD. For audio, the Realme 6 Pro has a single bottom firing speaker. Loudness here is just average, but compared to the regular Realme 6, the Pro does have a richer sound quality. The phone does have a 3.5mm jack too, if you want to plug in a standard pair of headphones. You have either 64 or 128 gigs of storage on board the Realme 6 Pro. This is expandable too via microSD. And the Realme 6 Pro has a side-mounted fingerprint reader which is built into the power button. It's super responsive. Just a light touch is enough to wake up and unlock the phone. The Realme 6 series phones are among the first devices to include the newest Realme UI over Android 10. It's a change from Oppo's Color OS that feels much closer to stock Android. The menus, notification shade, and app drawer all feel straightforward and clutter-free. Navigation is a little different from regular Android though. If you're using gestures, swiping from the sides still goes back, but swiping and holding from the sides will quickly switch between your two most recent apps. One of the main differences between this model and the regular Realme 6 is the chipset. Rather than a MediaTek one, this model has a new Qualcomm Snapdragon 720G. However, even though many people are fans of Snapdragon, the Pro model doesn't show a significant advantage over the vanilla one in either CPU or GPU tests. With that said though, performance is great here for a mid-range device. Everything runs smoothly, and we didn't have any problems with thermal throttling even after heavy use. The Realme 6 Pro is powered by a 4300 mAh battery, the same capacity as the Realme 6. Battery life here is just as excellent. The Pro scored an endurance rating of 107 hours in our proprietary battery tests. On top of that, charging speed is great too. The phone comes bundled with a 30-watt VOOC charger, and with it we were able to charge from 0 to 68% in half an hour. The Realme 6 Pro has a quad camera setup, impressive for a mid-ranger. There's a 64-megapixel quad-Bayer main cam, an 8-megapixel ultra-wide-angle cam, a 12-megapixel telephoto cam, and a 2-megapixel macro cam. In good light, 12-megapixel photos from the main camera are very good in quality, with pretty low noise and plenty of detail. We prefer these photos over the ones from the Realme 6. You get more detail here, wider dynamic range, and livelier colors. You can shoot with the main camera's nominal 64-megapixel resolution. This can result in some extra detail in the right conditions, but there is also more noise. Portraits are taken with the main camera, and are great in terms of subject separation. There are occasional mistakes with messier hair, but that's to be expected. Shots from the ultra-wide-angle cam are nice. There's good detail and wide dynamic range, but there's some visible noise, as well as some purple fringing here and there. The 6 Pro is one of the few Realme phones with a telephoto camera, and at the 2x native zoom we get some detailed, yet slightly noisy images. There's also a toggle for 5x digital zoom, and these come out okay if you're not looking too closely. The dedicated macro camera doesn't take great photos, and seems more like an excuse to bump up the camera count. There's plenty of noise, limited dynamic range, low detail, and dull colors. In low light, the main camera performs pretty well, better than the non-Pro anyway. There's nicer detail and colors are better preserved, and dynamic range is wider. Night mode brings a boost in the shadows and improves highlight retention. You do lose out a bit on sharpness though. If you shoot with the ultra-wide cam at night, the photos are usable but not good. You have okay detail and colors, but the exposure is dark. Turning on night mode here offers some improvements in the dynamic range, but is still just a barely usable photo. You can shoot with the telephoto cam in low light, and performance is alright. The zoom cam does have some issues focusing in low light, so you may need to take some backup shots, but the results are better than what you can get from the ultra-wide. You can use night mode here as well, and it gives you a brighter looking exposure, but the image is overall softer. The Realme 6 Pro has a dual selfie setup, consisting of a 16-megapixel main cam and an 8-megapixel ultra-wide-angle camera. Photos from the main selfie cam come out really nice in well-lit scenes. The HDR processing does sometimes have an effect on finer detail, but is not so bad. Besides the field of view, the ultra-wide selfie cam shots have an entirely different look. You get higher contrast, narrower dynamic range, and a different color rendition. We wish it was more consistent between the two cameras. Let's move on to video recording. You can shoot in up to 4K at 30 FPS with the main cam, and these videos have good detail and saturated colors and wide dynamic range. But the sharpening is a bit too much, and the video is overall a bit grainy. The telephoto cam can also shoot in 4K, and at 2x zoom the results are quite good, with plenty of detail. The ultra-wide angle cam can only shoot in up to 1080p at 30 FPS, and these are decent, but clearly inferior to what you can get from the other two cameras. As far as stabilization goes, well, 4K video doesn't have any, so unless you're using a tripod, you'll end up with jittery footage. In 1080p, you have always-on electronic stabilization. This works well, but it also means that videos in this resolution are a bit cropped. This is the S20 Ultra 5G, and compared to the other S20 models, this one stands out in a big way. It has a huge display, a larger battery, and the most advanced camera setup we've seen from Samsung. The phone is made of glass with a metal frame. Just a note that this is the 5G version, which has support for the potentially much faster 5G network speeds. There's apparently also an LTE-only version too. Looks-wise, it isn't very exciting. The cosmic gray finish doesn't do much to catch the eye, in contrast to the dazzling ones we saw from Samsung last year. The defining design element is the camera setup on the back, which is tall and takes up a lot of real estate. It's of course practical, but won't win any beauty contests. As a Samsung flagship, we'd be surprised if there wasn't any water resistance on this phone. And sure enough, you get full IP68 protection here. On the front is a giant 6.9-inch AMOLED display with a high QHD resolution, and up at the top is a punch hole cutout for the 40-megapixel quad-Bayer selfie camera. The screen is curved on the sides, but it's more subtle than on previous Samsung flagships, and should make accidental screen activations less of a problem. All of the S20s come with a new headline feature, and that's a 120Hz screen refresh rate. This means moving elements on the screen will look much smoother. But there's a caveat. You can only use the high refresh rate here if you turn the resolution down to 1080p, so you have to make a choice between a sharper experience or a smoother one. We generally preferred the smoother one. Even though the sharpness suffers a little, it's hard to notice the difference, and content still looks awesome. Colors are bland, but quite accurate, and you can make them punchier in settings. And there is support for HDR10+ too, if you're looking for that kind of content. On top of that, this display is one of the brightest we've ever tested, at up to almost 900 nits in auto mode and bright conditions. Otherwise, a manual slider by itself will get you up to 400. Under the display sits the phone's ultrasonic fingerprint reader. It works fine, though compared to the lightning-fast setups we've seen from some competitors, it is a bit slow. The S20 Ultra has a pair of stereo speakers for your audio, with the earpiece acting as the second speaker. These sound great. They're really loud and well balanced too. It comes as no surprise that there's no headphone jack on this phone, so you'll have to use the USB-C port, and a dongle is not included in the box. There are 3 storage tiers on the S20 Ultra, and they start at 128 gigs. Storage is expandable too through the card slot at the top. The user interface is Samsung's One UI 2.1 over Android 10. It comes with some tiny tweaks over the 2.0 version, such as rearrangement of some menus and settings. There is a brand new feature though. Now you can make video calls directly through the phone app with Google Duo. Now there's no need to download a third-party video chat. And you can use the power button as a shortcut for various mappable functions. But by default, it will activate the virtual assistant. The S20 Ultra comes with 2 variants as far as internals go. You either get a Snapdragon 865 or an Exynos 990 chipset. Both are top of the line, and offer the best performance you can get these days from an Android phone. On top of that, the display has 240Hz touch sensing for extra responsiveness when gaming. However, our Exynos unit was quick to heat up when running benchmarks or games, and we ran into thermal throttling after just a few minutes of use. The Galaxy S20 Ultra has a huge 5000 mAh battery inside, which you'd expect more from a mid-ranger with a focus on battery life. With the display set to 120Hz, the phone delivers good but not spectacular endurance, scoring 87 hours in our tests. Switching the display over to 60Hz and QHD, the results are better, with a score of 97 endurance hours. It's great, but still not what you'd expect from the big battery. Although the S20 Ultra supports 45-watt charging, you'll only get a 25-watt one in the box. It still gives you a speedy charge though, we were able to get from 0 to 64% in half an hour. And you have wireless charging here, as well as wireless power share, which you can use to top up other compatible devices. Now on to what is arguably the star of the show, the Galaxy S20 Ultra's quad camera setup. There's a whopping 108 megapixel main camera, a 48 megapixel periscope telephoto cam, a 12 megapixel ultra wide, and a TOF depth sensor. I'm going to do a quick summary of the camera's performance here, but we have another video where I go more in depth, if you're interested. Even though the 108 megapixel main cam is the headline feature, in stills we didn't find a ton of improvement quality-wise over last year's Note 10. But we really did enjoy the shallow depth of field that the large sensor provides, and this is what makes the camera stand out for us. The biggest benefit of the new camera system is really the higher quality zoom. The telephoto lens shoots at 4x natively, and these photos are excellent. Going further looks nice, all the way up to 10x zoom. The 100x zoom, though, is just a marketing gimmick. We were actually pleasantly surprised by the ultra-wide cam's nighttime shots, which are clearly better than the Note 10's. As far as video goes, 4K footage taken during the day looks great, as expected. But nighttime footage looks surprisingly awesome. It really benefits from the size of the 108 megapixel sensor. The major new feature as far as video recording goes is the ability to record in 8K at 24 FPS. It looks good, though it's hard to appreciate the benefits unless you have an 8K monitor, so we'd rather stick with 4K for now.